You have blamed the carbs, the portion size, the warm room, the comfortable chair, the time of day, the drowsiness that arrives 20 to 40 minutes after eating, the heaviness in your eyelids, the softening of your attention. The slow pull toward the couch is caused by 5 independent systems inside your body simultaneously shifting you toward sleep. 5 separate mechanisms, each operating through its own pathway, each producing drowsiness through a different physiological route, all of them converging on one instruction at once. Your willpower to stay awake operates through one system, the prefrontal cortex. The drowsiness operates through 5. The numbers are not in your favor, and the 5 pathways explain why no amount of determination has ever reliably defeated a post-meal slump. First pathway is the oldest and the most mechanical, a simple reallocation of blood that leaves your brain running on a reduced supply. Autonomic nervous system has 2 competing branches. The sympathetic branch keeps you alert, muscles ready, pupils responsive, heart rate elevated, blood flowing to the brain and skeletal muscles. The parasympathetic branch handles rest and digestion, slowing the heart, activating the gut, diverting resources from locomotion to processing. After a meal, the parasympathetic branch takes over. Your vagus nerve activates the digestive organs, increasing stomach motility, acid secretion, enzyme release from the pancreas, and the rhythmic contractions that move food through 6 to 9 meters of intestinal tract. This activation requires blood. The blood vessels supplying your digestive organs dilate to support the metabolically demanding work of breaking down and absorbing food. Blood flow to the gut increases by 25 to 50% after a meal. The blood has to come from somewhere. Your heart can increase its output modestly, but a meaningful portion of the post-meal blood redistribution comes from other vascular beds, including the vessels supplying your brain. Cerebral blood flow decreases by a small but measurable amount after large meals. Your brain receives slightly less oxygen and glucose per minute while the gut is claiming its share. Drowsiness is partly your brain running on reduced fuel delivery during the 60 to 90 minutes of peak digestive demand. Not a dramatic reduction, you do not lose consciousness. A subtle reduction enough to lower arousal, soften alertness, make the couch look inviting. A warm room amplifies the effect. Warmth causes peripheral vasodilation. Blood flows to the skin surface for cooling, competing with the gut's demand, and the combined diversion from the brain is larger than either demand alone. The drowsiness you attributed entirely to the meal was partly the room. Distinction matters here. Drowsiness after eating and fatigue are different problems. Fatigue is energy depletion, the body running low on fuel. Post-meal drowsiness arrives when fuel has just been delivered. You are drowsy after eating precisely because the body has resources to process, not because it lacks them. The confusion is common because both feel like low energy, but one is a deficit and the other is a redirect. Fatigue requires rest and calories. Post-meal drowsiness requires movement and time. If blood redistribution were the only pathway, the drowsiness would be mild and easily overridden. Coffee, standing up, walking around, any sympathetic activation would redirect blood back toward the brain and the muscles. The post-meal slump would be a minor inconvenience. It is not a minor inconvenience because the gut is simultaneously doing something the blood redistribution does not explain, sending a direct chemical instruction to your brain to reduce wakefulness. When fat and protein enter the first section of your small intestine, specialized cells in the intestinal wall secrete a gut hormone. The hormone's primary job is digestive. It triggers your gallbladder to release bile, stimulates your pancreas to release enzymes, and slows the rate at which your stomach empties into the intestine. These are housekeeping functions. The hormone manages the logistics of digestion, but the hormone also crosses into your brain and acts on receptors in the brainstem region that integrates signals from the vagus nerve. These receptors activate sleep-promoting neurons that directly inhibit the arousal centers, identical centers that norepinephrine and dopamine activate to keep you awake. The gut hormone is a pharmaceutical-grade sleep signal delivered to the brain after every meal containing fat or protein. Administering the hormone peripherally produces sleep in animal models within minutes, as Mansbach and colleagues demonstrated, and blocking the hormone's receptors blocks the post-meal sleep response. The drowsiness is hormone-mediated. Block the hormone, block the sleep. Your intestine is simultaneously issuing a chemical instruction to your brain: food has arrived, digestion requires resources, reduce wakefulness now. Second chemical pathway operates through different neurons and a different mechanism, and it explains why high carbohydrate meals produce more drowsiness than protein-heavy meals. Your brain contains a small population of wakefulness neurons in a region of the deep brain that functions as the master switch for staying awake. Destruction of these neurons produces narcolepsy, the inability to maintain wakefulness. During normal waking, they fire continuously, keeping your arousal centers active. They are the reason you can stay awake at all. Rising blood glucose after a meal suppresses their firing. A finding published in Neuron by Berdakov and colleagues demonstrated the mechanism. When glucose enters these neurons, it opens a specific type of potassium channel in the cell membrane. The open channel allows potassium to flow out of the cell, making the interior more negative, hyperpolarizing the neuron and reducing its firing rate. The neurons that keep you awake go quiet when glucose rises. Not a vague metabolic slowdown. A precision neurochemical event: glucose acting on a specific ion channel in a specific neuron population to reduce a specific wakefulness signal. Magnitude of the suppression is proportional to the glucose spike. A meal that produces a large, rapid rise in blood glucose: white bread, white rice, sugary foods, anything that converts quickly to glucose, suppresses the wakefulness neurons more than a meal that produces a slow, moderate rise. This is the physiological basis for the observation that a bowl of pasta produces more drowsiness than a steak of equal calories. The pasta produces a larger glucose spike. The larger spike opens more potassium channels. More channels open, more wakefulness neurons go quiet, more drowsiness arrives. If you have insulin resistance, if your blood glucose spikes higher and stays elevated longer after a meal, you experience more post-meal drowsiness than someone with normal insulin sensitivity eating an identical meal. The drowsiness is tracking the glucose curve. If you have noticed your post-meal slumps getting worse with age, the mechanism is likely here. Insulin sensitivity declines naturally across the adult lifespan, and the resulting higher glucose excursions produce greater suppression of the wakefulness neurons after every meal. Third pathway involves an amino acid competition that only tips in one direction after you eat, and the winner produces the raw material for your sleep hormone. Tryptophan is an amino acid present in most protein-containing foods. Your brain uses tryptophan to make serotonin, which your pineal gland then converts to melatonin, the hormone that promotes sleep. But tryptophan cannot simply flow into the brain from the bloodstream. It must cross a barrier, the blood-brain barrier, through a transporter it shares with 5 other amino acids. During fasting, all 6 amino acids compete for the transporter at roughly equal odds. Tryptophan, present in lower blood concentrations than its competitors, loses. Brain tryptophan stays low. Serotonin and melatonin production stay at baseline. After a carbohydrate-containing meal, the competition changes. Insulin is released to manage the rising glucose. Insulin drives the competing amino acids leucine, isoleucine, valine, phenylalanine, tyrosine out of the bloodstream and into your skeletal muscles for protein synthesis. Tryptophan is not taken up by muscle as efficiently. The competitors leave. Tryptophan stays. The ratio of tryptophan to its competitors in the blood rises sharply. Tryptophan wins the competition at the transporter. More tryptophan crosses into the brain. Serotonin production increases. Melatonin production follows. Drowsiness after a carbohydrate-rich meal is partly melatonin, your sleep hormone, produced through a competitive mechanism that only tips in tryptophan's favor when insulin clears its competitors from the blood. A protein-heavy meal without significant carbohydrate does not produce this effect because insulin secretion is lower and the competing amino acids remain in the blood at concentrations that block tryptophan's passage. Popular claim that turkey makes you sleepy because turkey contains tryptophan is wrong in its specifics. Turkey contains no more tryptophan than chicken, beef, or pork. The drowsiness after a holiday meal comes from the carbohydrates surrounding the turkey, the stuffing, the potatoes, the pie, producing the insulin spike that clears tryptophan's competitors. The turkey is innocent. The mashed potatoes are the mechanism. The folk wisdom of warm milk before bed operates through a version of this pathway. Milk contains tryptophan and a small amount of lactose, a sugar that produces a modest insulin response. The insulin clears enough competing amino acids to shift the transport ratio in tryptophan's favor. The effect is mild compared to a carbohydrate-heavy meal, but it operates through an identical competitive mechanism. The warmth of the milk is incidental to the chemistry. Cold milk would produce an identical transport shift, but the warmth adds a parasympathetic cue through gastric warming, and the cultural association with comfort and bedtime adds a conditioned relaxation response. The folk wisdom arrived at the right intervention for approximately the right reason through observation rather than biochemistry. Fourth pathway is the least obvious and the most recently understood, and it explains the sensation of mental fog that accompanies post-meal drowsiness, the feeling that your thinking has thickened rather than simply slowed. Your gut wall contains approximately 500 million neurons, a network sometimes described as a second brain, operating with enough complexity to coordinate digestion independently of your central nervous system. During fasting, this network runs at a maintenance level, monitoring, maintaining baseline motility, routine surveillance. After a meal, it activates massively, coordinating the contraction waves that move food forward, the secretion of digestive enzymes at precise locations, the absorption of nutrients through the intestinal lining, the immune surveillance of the food contents for pathogens. This activation generates a continuous stream of data that travels up the vagus nerve to the brainstem, information about gut distension, nutrient composition, motility status, chemical environment, immune activity. The brainstem must process this stream in real time. The processing diverts computational resources from maintaining cortical arousal. The gut network does not produce drowsiness through a hormone or a neurotransmitter. It produces a computational load that competes with wakefulness for processing bandwidth in the brainstem. The mental fog is computational rather than chemical, your brainstem handling a data stream from 500 million gut neurons and having less capacity available for the arousal maintenance that keeps your cortex sharp. 5 pathways do not peak simultaneously, and the staggered timing explains the shape of the drowsiness, the specific progression from mild heaviness to full slump to gradual recovery that you recognize from experience. Blood redistribution begins first within 5 to 10 minutes of eating. As the gut vessels dilate, cerebral blood flow starts declining before any hormonal signal has reached the brain. The gut hormone arrives second, secreted as fat and protein reach the small intestine, typically 15 to 25 minutes after eating. The glucose pathway peaks third. Blood glucose rises over 20 to 40 minutes depending on the meal's glycemic load, and the wakefulness neurons go quiet as the spike arrives. The tryptophan competition shifts fourth. Insulin must first clear the competing amino acids, which takes 30 to 45 minutes before tryptophan wins the transporter and melatonin production rises. The gut neuron computational load builds continuously and persists longest. The 500 million neurons remain at elevated activity for as long as active digestion continues, typically 90 minutes to 3 hours. Staggered onset produces the characteristic wave. First 10 minutes feel like settling, a mild reduction in alertness from blood redistribution alone. By 20 minutes, the gut hormone and glucose pathways have joined, and the drowsiness sharpens. By 30 to 40 minutes, all 5 are active, and the slump hits its peak. By 60 to 90 minutes, the blood redistribution resolves, the glucose spike has passed, the tryptophan competition is settling. The computational load persists longest, producing the residual fog that outlasts the acute drowsiness. Total duration from first heaviness to full recovery roughly 2 to 3 hours for a large meal. 5 pathways, all independent, all firing after every meal, 5 separate routes to one instruction, each through its own mechanism converging on sleep from 5 directions simultaneously. The redundancy reveals evolutionary pressure. It was important enough to ensure post-meal rest that the body evolved 5 separate locks on one door. A single pathway could be overridden by a threat signal. 5 are much harder to override. Voluntary override during digestion was, across evolutionary time, costly. Diverting blood back to muscles reduces digestive efficiency, wastes the metabolic investment in the meal, and risks physical exertion during a period when gut distension impairs diaphragmatic function. Digestion itself is metabolically expensive. The thermic effect of food, the energy your body spends breaking down, absorbing, and processing what you ate, accounts for 5 to 15% of the calories in the meal. A large meal requires hours of intensive metabolic processing. During that processing, every calorie diverted to locomotion or heightened alertness is a calorie not available for digestion. The drowsiness is a resource allocation strategy, the body prioritizing the metabolically expensive work of extracting nutrients over the metabolically expensive work of staying alert and ready to move. You now know the 5 systems. The question changes here from what produces the drowsiness to what determines how hard it hits. Because the 5 pathways do not fire at fixed intensity, every variable, meal size, composition, timing, temperature, age, alcohol, modulates which pathways fire hardest and how strongly the convergence lands. The composition of the meal determines which pathways fire hardest. Large meals activate all 5 pathways at higher intensity than small meals. High carbohydrate meals hit the glucose pathway hardest. High fat meals hit the gut hormone hardest. The meal that maximizes drowsiness, large, high carbohydrate, high fat, eaten in a warm environment in the early afternoon when circadian alertness has a natural dip. Every holiday dinner, every Sunday roast, every birthday celebration that ends with the entire family asleep in the living room. 5 systems firing at maximum intensity simultaneously. The post-meal nap, after a large holiday meal, is 5 independent physiological systems overriding 1 prefrontal cortex. Meal that minimizes drowsiness, small to moderate portion, protein dominant with low glycemic carbohydrate and moderate fat. Each pathway fires at reduced intensity. The cumulative drowsiness is substantially less. Timing matters independently of composition. Circadian alertness has a natural dip in the early afternoon between roughly 1 and 3, regardless of whether you have eaten. The dip is driven by the circadian clock, not by food. But eating during the circadian dip combines the 5 meal-induced pathways with the circadian alertness trough, producing a drowsiness that neither the meal nor the clock would produce alone. Eating an identical meal at 7 in the evening, when circadian alertness is higher, produces less drowsiness than eating it at 1 in the afternoon. Same food, same pathways, different circadian context. There is a second timing effect that operates through the glucose pathway specifically. The circadian insulin pattern, the sleep timing discussion described, operates here as well. Your body processes glucose more efficiently in the morning than in the evening. An identical carbohydrate load produces a smaller glucose spike at 8 in the morning than at 8 in the evening because the morning pancreas releases insulin more effectively and the morning muscle cells absorb glucose more readily. The smaller morning spike means the glucose pathway fires at lower intensity. Breakfast produces less drowsiness than dinner from identical carbohydrates, not because morning alertness overrides the pathways, but because insulin sensitivity is at its circadian peak. Reverse is also true. Late night eating, the snack at 10, the meal at 11 occurs when insulin sensitivity is at its lowest. The glucose spike is larger. The tryptophan competition tips further because insulin still clears the competitors even when glucose clearance is inefficient. Late night eating activates the 5 pathways during the circadian window when the sleep system is already primed. The drowsiness from a late meal is disproportionate to the meal's size because the circadian system and the meal-induced pathways are pushing in one direction simultaneously. Alcohol interacts with the 5 pathways in a way that amplifies the drowsiness beyond what either the meal or the alcohol would produce alone. Alcohol is a sedative. It promotes sleep through a mechanism independent of all 5 meal pathways. But alcohol also impairs glucose regulation, producing a higher and more prolonged glucose spike from a meal eaten with a drink than from an identical meal eaten without one. The higher spike amplifies the glucose pathway. Alcohol also accelerates gastric emptying of liquids, while slowing emptying of solids, delivering nutrients to the small intestine in a pattern that maximizes the gut hormone pathway. And alcohol directly enhances the parasympathetic shift, amplifying the blood redistribution. A large meal with 2 glasses of wine activates the 5 meal pathways at elevated intensity, plus the alcohol's independent sedative effect, 6 sleep-promoting mechanisms operating simultaneously. The post-dinner drowsiness that arrives after a meal with wine is a multiplicative interaction, not the sum of the meal's drowsiness and the alcohol's drowsiness where each amplifies the others. The combination explains why dinner parties end with guests asleep in chairs, and why business dinners with wine produce the most impaired afternoon cognitive performance of any meal pattern studied. If your post-meal drowsiness has worsened with age, 3 of the 5 pathways explain why. Insulin sensitivity declines the glucose spike after an identical meal is higher at 55 than at 25. Cardiovascular efficiency declines, the heart compensates less effectively for gut blood demand, amplifying the blood redistribution. Autonomic flexibility declines, the parasympathetic shift after a meal is slower to resolve, extending the duration of the drowsy period. The meal is the same, the body processing it has changed. Pattern most older adults recognize without naming: dinner at 6:30, television at 7, asleep on the couch by 7:20. The evening meal activates the 5 pathways. The seated position removes the sympathetic activation that walking would provide. The warm room amplifies the blood redistribution. The television provides low-demand sensory input that does not compete effectively with the drowsiness signals, and the circadian system is already withdrawing alertness by evening. 5 meal pathways plus circadian withdrawal plus seated warmth plus 3 age-related amplifications. The couch sleep after dinner is a convergence of at least 8 factors arriving simultaneously, and you have exactly 1 prefrontal cortex trying to resist all of them. A 10-minute walk between dinner and the couch interrupts 3 of those factors before the convergence peaks. The walk is a timing intervention, not exercise, catching the blood redistribution and glucose pathways before they reach full intensity. There is a clinical consequence of the blood redistribution pathway that matters specifically if you are over 65, because the cerebral blood flow reduction can cross from drowsiness into something more acute. Postprandial hypotension, a measurable drop in blood pressure after eating, affects up to a third of older adults. The mechanism is the blood redistribution pathway operating in a cardiovascular system with reduced compensatory capacity. In a younger body, the heart increases output and peripheral vessels constrict to maintain blood pressure when the gut vessels dilate. In an older body, the baroreceptor reflexes are slower, the cardiac response is weaker, and the blood pressure drop is not fully compensated. The result is not just drowsiness but lightheadedness, dizziness, and in some cases, falls. If you have experienced dizziness after a large meal, particularly if you stand up quickly after eating, the mechanism is the blood redistribution exceeding your cardiovascular system's ability to compensate. The drowsiness and the dizziness share a pathway. The drowsiness is the mild version. The dizziness is an identical pathway in a body where compensation has declined further. If you take blood pressure medication, the post-meal drop compounds the medication's effect. The combination produces a larger total pressure reduction than either alone. Smaller meals reduce the magnitude of the blood redistribution. Eating more frequently with smaller portions produces less gut vasodilation per meal, less cerebral blood flow reduction, less blood pressure drop. The clinical guidance for postprandial hypotension is what the 5-pathway model predicts: smaller meals, lower carbohydrate, slower gastric emptying through protein and fat, and avoiding standing immediately after eating. The physiology and the clinical advice converge because they describe one mechanism at different severities. Every culture that developed in warm climates independently arrived at one solution: the midday rest. The Spanish siesta, the Italian riposo, the South Asian practice of resting after the main meal, the Greek mesimeri. Each emerged independently. None were developed from neuroscience. All align with the 5-pathway architecture: the largest meal of the day eaten when circadian alertness dips, the 5 pathways firing at maximum intensity, and the cultural response being a 20 to 40-minute rest that complies with the physiological demand rather than fighting it. The siesta cultures did not discover the 5 pathways. They observed the outcome: people fall asleep after the midday meal, and built the schedule around it. The 5-pathway model explains why these cultures independently converged on one practice. The biology is universal, the behavior was adaptive, and the cultures that permitted rest during peak postprandial drowsiness may have extracted more nutritional value from their meals by allowing uninterrupted digestion. Industrial work schedules eliminated the midday rest in most Western economies. The elimination did not eliminate the 5 pathways. The biology still fires. The schedule no longer accommodates it. The post-lunch productivity dip that every office worker recognizes, the 2 o'clock meeting where nobody is sharp, the afternoon emails that take twice as long to write, is the 5-pathway architecture colliding with a work schedule that was designed for machines, not for digestive physiology. 5-pathway model explains something that surprises people who try intermittent fasting for the first time: the unexpected sharpness of the fasted afternoon. Skipping lunch means all 5 pathways stay silent. No gut hormone. No glucose spike. No tryptophan competition shift. No blood redistribution. No gut neuron activation. 5 zeros. Result is an afternoon with none of the drowsiness the lunch-eating population experiences at that hour. The fasted afternoon is what your brain's alertness level actually is when the 5 pathways are not suppressing it. The drowsiness you have experienced after every midday meal, your entire life, was never your natural afternoon state. You only discover the natural state when you remove the trigger. This does not mean skipping meals is the recommendation. The body needs food, and the 5 pathways evolve because digestion requires rest. The observation matters because it demonstrates the model from the reverse direction. The drowsiness tracks the meal, not the time of day. Fiber slows the entire cascade, and the mechanism explains why a salad with grilled chicken produces less drowsiness than a sandwich of equal calories. Fiber delays gastric emptying. Food remains in the stomach longer, releasing into the small intestine at a slower rate. Slower intestinal delivery means less gut hormone release per minute, a smaller and more gradual glucose rise, less insulin released at once, less tryptophan competition shift, and more gradual gut neuron activation. Every pathway fires at lower peak intensity because the nutrient delivery is distributed across a longer window rather than arriving in a concentrated pulse. The total activation is similar. The body still digests the meal, but the peak is flattened. The drowsiness arrives as a mild, extended background rather than a sharp 20-minute wall. The fiber does not prevent the 5 pathways from firing. It staggers them. Same architecture explains why eating the largest meal at midday and eating lightly in the evening reduces total daily drowsiness, not because the midday meal produces less drowsiness than an evening meal of identical size, but because the midday drowsiness can be accommodated by a brief rest or a walk, while the evening drowsiness compounds with the circadian sleep drive and produces a premature shutdown that fragments the evening hours. Moving caloric mass to midday concentrates the 5-pathway activation at the point in the day when the circadian system provides the most competing alertness, partially buffering the drowsiness. Moving caloric mass to the evening activates the 5 pathways when the circadian system is already withdrawing alertness, producing a drowsiness that arrives earlier and harder than identical calories would have produced at noon. Walking after eating interrupts 3 of the 5 pathways simultaneously. Sympathetic activation partially reverses the blood redistribution. Muscular glucose uptake flattens the spike, and physical movement directly opposes the parasympathetic dominance the meal induced. 3 of 5 pathways partially reversed by 1 behavior. Coffee addresses only one. It blocks adenosine, but does not touch the blood redistribution, the gut hormone, the glucose pathway, or the tryptophan competition. 20-minute nap is the alternative that works with the 5 pathways rather than against them. The body is issuing a 5-channel instruction to rest during digestion. Complying with that instruction for 20 minutes, not longer, because sleep inertia from a longer nap produces grogginess that outlasts the digestive demand, aligns your behavior with the physiological reality. The nap is the body's resource allocation strategy succeeding at its intended purpose. 5 systems demanded rest. You rested. Digestion proceeds at optimal efficiency. You wake when the demand subsides. That redundancy, 5 locks on one door, each evolved independently, each ensuring rest during digestion, even if the other 4 were overridden by threat, is the selection pressure that ended the question of whether post-meal drowsiness is a flaw or a feature for me. 5 systems, all firing after every meal, all producing drowsiness through independent mechanisms. all resistant to voluntary override because voluntary override was evolutionarily costly during digestion. The next time the heaviness arrives, 20 minutes after eating, the eyelids, the softening attention, the pull toward rest, you are not experiencing a failure of willpower. You are experiencing 5 physiological systems outvoting 1 prefrontal cortex. The vote is not close. It was never close. The body designed it that way.